Did you know? Archaeologists discover the pre-Diluvian people who built the world. Klaus Smith trembled as his brush revealed another centimeter of the stone pillar. 23 years. 23 years of mockery, funding denials, and colleagues whispering career suicide behind his back. But there it was, carved into a megalithic pillar that shouldn't exist. A procession of animals so detailed, so impossibly ancient, that it threatened to shatter everything humanity believed about its own origins. Professor Smith, you need to see this. His assistant's voice cracked with something between terror and wonder. We found another circle. The stones, they're bigger than the last ones. Klaus's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from age, he was only 52, but from the weight of what he was uncovering. The Turkish sun beat mercilessly on his neck, but he barely noticed. Beneath his fingers lay proof of something the academic world had spent decades dismissing as biblical fantasy, an advanced civilization that built the impossible before history even began. The year was 1995, and Klaus had just committed the ultimate heresy in archaeology. He'd claimed that a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey, a place shepherds called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, held the remains of humanity's first temple. Not a settlement. Not a burial ground. A temple. Built by people who supposedly didn't have written language, metal tools, or even agriculture. His colleagues at the German Archaeological Institute had been less than supportive. "You're chasing ghosts," Dr. Heinrich Werner had told him at the last conference, barely concealing his contempt. "Stone circles in Turkey? You sound like a conspiracy theorist looking for Atlantis." But Klaus had seen something in those initial surveys that others refused to acknowledge. The geomagnetic readings showed structures beneath the soil that defied rational explanation. Massive. Organized. Ancient beyond measure. The real nightmare began when the carbon dating results came back. 9600 BC. Klaus had stared at that number for 3 hours straight, checking and rechecking the laboratory reports. If this was accurate, Göbekli Tepe predated Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predated the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predated pottery, the wheel, and the very concept of civilization itself. "It's a mistake," Werner had declared when Klaus presented the findings. "Your samples were contaminated. No hunter-gatherers could build something like this." But as Klaus's team carefully excavated that first summer, the evidence became undeniable. These weren't random stones. They were shaped pillars, some weighing over 60 tons, arranged in precise circles. Each one covered with intricate carvings: foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures. And something else. Something that made Klaus's blood run cold. Human hands. Carved into the stone. But not primitive stick figures. These were anatomically perfect, positioned as if the pillars themselves were meant to represent beings, watchers from an age before the flood wiped everything clean. The question that haunted Klaus's dreams wasn't just who built this. It was why had someone buried it? Every circle at Göbekli Tepe had been deliberately filled with rubble and soil sometime around 800 BC. Not destroyed. Not abandoned. Carefully, methodically entombed, as if the builders wanted to hide their creation from something, or someone, coming after them. What were they running from? Klaus whispered to himself as the setting sun painted the excavation site blood-red. He didn't know it yet, but the answer lay scattered across 20 acres of Turkish hillside, 40,000 animal bones that would rewrite the story of human existence. If you're captivated by this mystery and want to see where this impossible discovery leads, make sure you're subscribed, because what Klaus found next would force science and ancient scripture into a collision that neither could walk away from unchanged. The academic assassination began 3 months after the carbon dating results went public. Dr. Heinrich Werner didn't just criticize Klaus's findings, he orchestrated a systematic campaign to destroy his credibility. At the International Archaeological Symposium in Berlin, Werner presented what he called a necessary intervention against pseudoscience infiltrating serious research. Dr. Smith claims that primitive hunter-gatherers, people who supposedly lived in caves and survived on berries, somehow organized labor forces to move 60-ton stones across miles of terrain, Werner's voice dripped with manufactured concern as he addressed the packed auditorium. He suggests they did this without wheels, without draft animals, without any of the technological foundations we know are prerequisites for monumental architecture. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't archaeology. It's fantasy. The room erupted in applause. Klaus watched from the back row, his career disintegrating in real time. But Werner wasn't finished. He'd brought ammunition. More concerning is Dr. Smith's recent pivot toward, and I quote from his preliminary report, possible connections between Göbekli Tepe and antediluvian biblical narratives. Werner paused for effect, letting the words hang like an accusation. He's not just making scientific errors. He's weaponizing archaeology to validate religious mythology. Klaus felt his face burn. He'd mentioned the parallels to Genesis in one internal report, a single paragraph exploring why ancient cultures across continents shared flood narratives. Now Werner was twisting it into something unforgivable in academic circles: faith-based research. The funding disappeared within weeks. The German Archaeological Institute quietly reassigned Klaus's grants to more promising projects. His graduate assistants were encouraged to find new advisors. Even his wife, Anna, started leaving articles about early retirement on the kitchen table. "Maybe it's time to let someone else take over," she said one night, her voice gentle but firm. "You've given them enough. Let younger archaeologists fight this battle." Klaus couldn't explain to her that there was no one else. The discovery was too dangerous, too paradigm-shattering. If he walked away, Werner would ensure Göbekli Tepe got buried again, this time in bureaucratic red tape and academic dismissal. So Klaus did something desperate. He liquidated his retirement account, remortgaged the house in Hamburg, and returned to Turkey with a skeleton crew of 2 students willing to risk their careers for truth. That's when they found the bones. 40,000 fragments scattered across the excavation site. At first, Klaus thought they'd stumbled onto an ancient hunting ground. But as his team catalogued the remains, a disturbing pattern emerged. Sheep, cattle, goats, gazelles, wild boars, leopards, wolves, even hedgehogs and weasels. Dozens of bird species. The site contained representatives from nearly every land animal known to have existed in the region during that period. "It's like someone gathered every creature they could find and brought them here," whispered Sarah Chen, one of Klaus's remaining graduate students. Her hands trembled as she logged another fragment. "Professor, this reminds me of—" "Don't say it," Klaus cut her off. He knew exactly what she was thinking. But saying it out loud would give Werner more ammunition. The Noah's Ark comparison was too obvious, too inflammatory. Yet the evidence kept mounting. Werner's colleague, Dr. James Hartford from Oxford, grudgingly visited the site in 1997. Klaus watched him examine the bone distributions, saw the exact moment comprehension dawned on his face. "This is a zoo," Hartford muttered, almost to himself. "A Stone Age zoo." The phrase stuck. Within months, archaeological journals were calling Göbekli Tepe the world's first zoological collection, a designation that raised more questions than answers. Why would hunter-gatherers create something so elaborate? What purpose did it serve? But Klaus had noticed something else. Something that turned his stomach. Among those 40,000 bone fragments, representing hundreds of species and thousands of individual animals, they'd found exactly 2 fish. Not 2 species. 2 individual specimens. A small catfish and one unidentified aquatic creature. The absence was statistically impossible. The nearest river was less than 5 miles away. Fish would have been a primary food source. Yet someone had deliberately excluded them from this massive animal collection. Klaus spent 3 sleepless nights cross-referencing the findings against every archaeological database he could access. The pattern held. Göbekli Tepe documented land animals with obsessive precision but treated aquatic life as if it didn't exist. Then Sarah made the discovery that changed everything. "Professor, you need to see Pillar 43 right now." Her voice cracked over the satellite phone. I think it's a star map." Klaus practically ran to the excavation trench. There, illuminated by portable floodlights, Sarah pointed to a series of symbols carved above the animal processions. Not random decorative elements. Deliberate, astronomical markers. These symbols match known comet fragments, Sarah explained, her finger tracing the carved patterns. And this arrangement here, it corresponds to a specific stellar configuration that only occurs during major celestial events. Klaus's heart hammered. When? According to the alignment, approximately 10,950 BC. Right at the end of the last ice age. The same period when global temperatures spiked dramatically. When massive flooding reshaped coastlines. When megafauna like woolly mammoths vanished almost overnight. When human populations crashed to near extinction levels in what geneticists called the bottleneck event. Klaus pulled out his worn Bible, a gift from his grandmother, kept more from sentiment than faith. He flipped to Genesis, to the passage he'd tried so hard to ignore. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. And all the high hills, that were under the whole heaven, were covered. His hands shook as he read the next verse. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl, and of cattle, and of beast, and of every creeping thing, and every man, every land animal. Meticulously documented at Göbekli Tepe. But no fish. Because fish didn't need saving from a flood. Sarah, Klaus whispered, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. What if we're not looking at a temple? What if this is a memorial? The implications hit him like a physical blow. Someone had built Göbekli Tepe after a cataclysm. They'd documented every species that survived. They'd carved warnings into stone about cosmic events that triggered global destruction. And then, for reasons Klaus still couldn't fathom, they'd buried the entire complex, hiding it from future generations. Werner's voice echoed in Klaus's memory. You're weaponizing archaeology to validate religious mythology. But what if it wasn't mythology? What if the ancient texts weren't primitive superstition but actual historical records from survivors of something humanity had forgotten? Klaus stared at the carved stone pillar, at the procession of animals frozen in time, and realized with absolute certainty that someone was going to try very hard to stop him from sharing this truth. He just didn't know yet how far they'd go. Klaus made a decision that night that would either vindicate him or destroy what remained of his reputation. He would document everything in secret before Werner could mobilize another attack. For 18 months, Klaus operated in near total isolation. He hired local Turkish workers who didn't care about academic politics, paid them from his dwindling savings, and excavated with surgical precision. Every artifact, every bone fragment, every carved symbol was photographed, measured, and catalogued in triplicate. He kept duplicate records in 3 separate locations, one in Turkey, one with Sarah in Berlin, and one in a safety deposit box in Switzerland. The paranoia felt justified when Klaus discovered someone had attempted to break into his site office. Nothing was stolen, but his field notes had been photographed. Werner's reach extended further than he'd imagined. But Klaus had learned to be careful. The real discoveries, the ones that would change everything, he kept locked in his memory and encrypted on a hard drive that never left his possession. The breakthrough came during a brutal August excavation of what they designated Circle D. As workers cleared debris from around a massive central pillar, Klaus noticed something that made his breath catch. Symbols carved in a continuous band around the stone's base. Not animal representations. These were different. Geometric patterns. Repeating sequences. Something that looked disturbingly like a primitive writing system. Professor, I think you should stop. Sarah's voice carried a warning. She'd flown in secretly to help with the documentation. If this is what I think it is, we're looking at written language 6,000 years before it supposedly existed. Klaus ran his fingers over the carved grooves. The symbols had a mathematical precision that felt intentional, systematic. He'd seen similar patterns before, in his research on Aboriginal Australian rock art. That connection had bothered him for months. How could people separated by oceans and millennia share such specific symbolic languages? The academic consensus was convergent evolution, different cultures independently developing similar representations. But standing there, touching symbols carved 11,000 years ago, Klaus felt the weight of a different explanation. What if these weren't separate developments? What if they were remnants of something older, something global that existed before the cataclysm fragmented humanity into isolated pockets? The Bible described it clearly, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Genesis 11 verse 1. Klaus had dismissed that verse as metaphorical his entire career. Now, staring at evidence of a shared symbolic system across continents, he wasn't so sure. He spent the next 3 months cross-referencing every symbol at Göbekli Tepe with archaeological databases from around the world. The results were undeniable. Similar patterns appeared in Aboriginal Australian sites, in pre-Columbian American petroglyphs, in Polynesian rock carvings. Always dated to the same narrow window, 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Right after the Ice Age cataclysm. It was as if survivors of a global civilization had scattered to the farthest corners of Earth, each carrying fragments of a shared cultural memory. Over millennia, those fragments evolved into distinct traditions, but the underlying patterns, the genetic code of that original culture, remained visible to anyone willing to look. Klaus's hands trembled as he compiled the evidence. This wasn't just about one archaeological site anymore. This was about rewriting the entire story of human civilization. But he needed something irrefutable. Something so undeniable that even Werner couldn't dismiss it as coincidence or contamination. That's when Sarah made contact with Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a geneticist at Kyoto University who'd published controversial papers on the population bottleneck in human evolution. Her research suggested that around 70,000 years ago, the human population crashed to fewer than 10,000 individuals, a near-extinction event that created a genetic bottleneck visible in modern DNA. But Tanaka's more recent work focused on a second, more recent bottleneck. One that occurred approximately 12,000 years ago and affected not just humans but nearly every large mammal species on Earth. Dr. Smith, Tanaka's voice crackled over the secure video call Sarah had arranged. My team has analyzed genetic samples from over 200 modern species. The data is consistent. Almost all show evidence of descending from extremely small founding populations during this period. In some cases, we're talking about single breeding pairs. Klaus felt dizzy. Single pairs? Statistically, it's the only explanation for the genetic uniformity we observe. Something reduced Earth's megafauna to remnant populations around 10,000 BC, and only a handful survived to repopulate. What could cause that? Tanaka's pause lasted too long. Dr. Smith, officially, we attribute it to climate change at the end of the Ice Age. But between us, the genetic signatures don't match gradual environmental pressure. They match a sudden catastrophic event that killed indiscriminately across all continents simultaneously. Klaus's mind raced. Dr. Tanaka, what if I told you I found physical evidence of survivors gathering animals, representatives of every species, in one location right after this event? The silence on the other end was profound. That would change everything, Tanaka finally whispered. Klaus worked feverishly through the winter of 1998. He compiled genetic data from Tanaka's research, geological evidence of massive flooding at the end of the Ice Age, astronomical records of cometary impacts, and the physical evidence from Göbekli Tepe into a comprehensive analysis. The picture that emerged was terrifying in its clarity. Approximately 10,950 BC, Earth experienced a cataclysm. Cometary fragments impacted ice sheets, triggering catastrophic melting. Sea levels rose by over 400 feet in a matter of centuries, geological seconds. Coastal civilizations vanished beneath the waves. Megafauna went extinct. Human populations crashed. But some survived. The survivors gathered in southeastern Turkey, near modern-day Göbekli Tepe, probably because it was elevated enough to escape the worst flooding. They documented what they'd witnessed, the animals they'd saved, the cosmic events that triggered the disaster, the warning signs in the heavens. And then they built a memorial. 20 acres of carved stone pillars arranged in sacred circles. A testament to what humanity had lost and somehow survived. But the most haunting question remained, why bury it? Klaus found the answer in Circle F, during the final excavation before his money ran out completely. Beneath the massive pillars, they discovered something unexpected, a foundation layer that predated the stone circles themselves. Not by centuries. By millennia. Professor, these samples are dating to 13,000 BC, Sarah said, her voice hollow with shock. Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning. It's built on top of something older. Klaus's world tilted. If structures existed before the cataclysm, if Göbekli Tepe was actually a post-flood reconstruction of something more ancient, then the biblical narrative wasn't just metaphorically true, it was historically accurate. There had been an advanced pre-flood civilization. They'd built cities, developed technology, created art and architecture that rivaled anything modern. And then something, divine judgment, cosmic catastrophe, or both, wiped them from existence. Göbekli Tepe was humanity's desperate attempt to remember. To preserve the knowledge before it was lost forever. To warn future generations. This happened. We survived. But we must never forget. And then, for reasons Klaus was only beginning to understand, they deliberately buried that warning. Klaus sat alone that night in his tent, surrounded by evidence that would redefine human history. He thought about Werner, about the academic establishment, about the comfortable narratives that would crumble under the weight of this truth. He thought about his grandmother, who'd given him that Bible with a simple inscription, "Some truths are too dangerous to forget." Klaus finally understood what she meant. The next morning, he called Sarah with instructions that surprised even himself. "Schedule a presentation," he said. "International Archaeological Conference in Istanbul. I don't care if Werner's there. Actually, I hope he is. It's time to show them everything." Sarah hesitated. "Professor, they'll crucify you." "They're already crucifying me," Klaus replied, staring at the carved stone pillar catching morning light. Might as well give them a reason. He had 6 weeks to prepare the most important presentation of his life. 6 weeks to organize decades of suppressed evidence into an argument so compelling that even his enemies would have to acknowledge the truth. Klaus Smith, the laughingstock of academic archaeology, was about to force the entire scientific community to confront an impossible question. What if the ancients weren't primitive at all? What if we're the ones who forgot? The Istanbul Conference Center buzzed with over 800 archaeologists from 43 countries. Klaus stood backstage, watching Werner work the crowd like a politician at a rally. Every handshake, every casual dismissal of that German with his fantasy temple, Werner was poisoning the well before Klaus even took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next presenter needs no introduction," the moderator's voice dripped with barely concealed skepticism. "Dr. Klaus Smith will discuss his findings from Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey." The applause was polite. Scattered. Klaus noticed Werner in the third row, arms crossed, wearing the smile of someone about to watch an execution. Klaus stepped into the lights. 11,000 years ago, something happened that humanity has spent millennia trying to forget. Today, I'm going to show you the memory carved in stone by the survivors. The first image filled the massive screen, Pillar 43, with its procession of animals and astronomical symbols rendered in stunning detail. This is not primitive art. This is a historical document created by people who witnessed the end of their world. Werner shifted uncomfortably. Klaus pressed on. "For 3 years, my team has excavated 20 acres at Göbekli Tepe. We've uncovered stone circles containing pillars that weigh over 60 tons each, carved and erected by people who supposedly didn't have metal tools or architectural knowledge." Klaus paused, letting the tension build. The academic consensus is wrong. A ripple of murmurs spread through the auditorium. The next slide showed the bone analysis. "We've catalogued 40,000 animal bone fragments from the site. Representatives from nearly every land species. Cattle, sheep, wild boar, leopards, wolves, dozens of bird species." He clicked again. The number appeared in stark white. 2. "That's how many fish we found. 2 individual specimens across the entire excavation." Unless whoever built Göbekli Tepe was documenting survivors of an event that specifically killed land animals while leaving aquatic life unaffected. This is absurd. Werner's voice cut through the auditorium. He stood, face flushed. You're manipulating data to support a biblical narrative. Klaus had expected this. He'd counted on it. Dr. Werner raises a valid concern. So let me show you something that has nothing to do with religious texts. The next slide showed genetic charts from Dr. Tanaka's research. Color-coded timelines mapped population bottlenecks across 200 species. This is peer-reviewed genetic data from Kyoto University. Every major mammal species on Earth shows evidence of descending from extremely small founding populations approximately 12,000 years ago. In many cases, single breeding pairs. Klaus watched Werner's face drain of color. What if an ancient culture, facing extinction from a global catastrophe, attempted to preserve breeding pairs of every species they could gather? What if they succeeded? And what if they built a monument to document what they'd done? The auditorium went silent. Klaus advanced through slides showing symbolic correlations between Göbekli Tepe and Aboriginal Australian art, Polynesian petroglyphs, pre-Columbian rock art. The patterns were undeniable. These cultures had no contact. Yet they share symbolic languages that only make sense if inherited from a common ancestor, a global civilization before the cataclysm fragmented humanity. Coincidence? Werner shouted. Klaus smiled. He'd saved the best for last. Then explain this. The image that filled the screen made the entire audience gasp. Pillar 56. The massive stone uncovered in Klaus's final excavation. Dozens of animals arranged in pairs. Male and female. Identifiable by anatomical details carved with impossible precision. Lions with lionesses. Bulls with cows. Each pair separated by carved lines like holding pens. And at the top, two human figures with hands raised, as if guiding the procession below. This pillar predates animal husbandry by 6,000 years. Yet it shows organized pairing of species suggesting deliberate preservation. Not hunting. Preservation. The room erupted. Archaeologists shouting questions, cameras flashing. But Klaus only watched Werner, who had gone pale, his hands gripping the armrests. There's one more thing, Klaus said, and the room gradually quieted. We found foundations beneath the circles dating to 13,000 BC, before the cataclysm. Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning of civilization. It's humanity's attempt to rebuild and remember after everything was destroyed. Klaus pulled out his grandmother's Bible. The gesture was deliberate, provocative. He opened to Genesis and read, "And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female." I'm not asking you to accept religious texts as science. I'm asking you to consider that these texts might be the last surviving records of real events that shaped human history. Then came the voice Klaus hadn't expected. He's right. Dr. James Hartford stood in the middle of the auditorium. The Oxford professor who'd dismissed Klaus's work 3 years ago. I've spent 6 months reviewing Dr. Smith's data. I went to Turkey. I examined the site personally. Everything he's showing you is accurate. Hartford turned to face Werner directly. And I discovered something else. Dr. Werner knew about the genetic research 18 months ago. He received Dr. Tanaka's preliminary data and deliberately suppressed it because it correlated with Smith's findings. The auditorium exploded. Werner tried to speak, but his voice was drowned by colleagues demanding explanations. Klaus stood frozen at the podium, barely processing what was happening. Hartford was now presenting documents, emails, funding records showing Werner's systematic efforts to bury contradicting evidence. Sarah appeared beside Klaus, tears streaming. "You did it. Professor, you actually did it." But Klaus felt no triumph. Only exhaustion and profound sadness for how close humanity had come to losing this truth forever. Conference organizers escorted Werner from the auditorium. His career was over. But as Klaus watched his old antagonist leave, shoulders slumped, face ashen, he felt no satisfaction. Only the weight of responsibility. Because now the world would know. The survivors had built Göbekli Tepe as a warning and testimony. They'd documented the animals they saved, the cosmic events they witnessed, the civilization they'd lost. They'd carved it all into stone and then buried it, hiding their memorial from something they feared. For 11,000 years, that warning had waited beneath Turkish soil. And Klaus Smith had finally brought it back into the light. 3 months after Istanbul, Klaus returned to Göbekli Tepe one last time. Not as a ridiculed outsider, but as the archaeologist who'd rewritten human history. Funding poured in from institutions that had previously slammed doors in his face. Werner's name had been quietly scrubbed from academic journals, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about ego-destroying integrity. But Klaus felt no vindication as he stood among the stone pillars at dawn. Only questions that kept him awake at night. Sarah joined him, carrying 2 cups of Turkish coffee. The university approved another 5 years of excavation. We can finally do this right. Klaus nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the massive pillars catching first light. We've answered who built this and when. But we still don't know the most important question. Why they buried it. They'd spent weeks analyzing the fill material used to entomb the circles. It wasn't haphazard destruction. Someone had carefully, almost lovingly, covered each pillar with layers of soil and rubble. Preserving rather than destroying. Hiding rather than abandoning. Klaus walked to pillar 56, running his hand over the carved procession of animals. The people who survived the cataclysm witnessed something traumatic beyond our comprehension. An advanced civilization wiped out in years. Millions dead. Knowledge lost. The entire world reshaped by catastrophic flooding. He paused, struggling with words for something he barely understood. Maybe they realized that remembering made it harder to move forward. Maybe the trauma was too deep. So they buried their own memorial, choosing collective amnesia over collective grief. The sun crested the horizon, painting the Turkish hills gold. In that light, the ancient pillars seemed almost alive, witnesses to a choice made 11,000 years ago. That's incredibly sad, Sarah said quietly. It's incredibly human. We do it all the time. Bury painful memories. Start over. Convince ourselves this time will be different. His phone buzzed. National Geographic was arriving that afternoon. BBC was producing a series. Hollywood producers wanted adaptation rights. Göbekli Tepe was becoming a sensation, and Klaus was its reluctant prophet. Professor, Sarah asked, what do you think really happened back then? Not the science, the story. What led to the cataclysm? Klaus thought about the genetic bottlenecks, the extinction events, the sudden collapse of what must have been a sophisticated global culture. I think they forgot something essential. Maybe they became so advanced, so powerful, that they stopped seeing themselves as part of nature and started seeing themselves as masters of it. And nature, or God, or the universe, reminded them otherwise. He looked at Sarah directly. The survivors didn't just document the animals they saved. They documented humility. Every carved pillar is a reminder that we're not separate from creation. We're part of it. And when we forget that, when we become arrogant enough to think we've conquered the natural order, that's when everything collapses. So what do we do with that knowledge? We tell the story. We show the evidence. And mostly, we remember that this happened before, and it could happen again. That evening, Klaus received an unexpected email from his wife, Anna. They'd separated during the darkest days of his obsession with Göbekli Tepe. The subject line read, I understand now. I watched your presentation from Istanbul. I finally understand why you couldn't let this go. You weren't chasing glory or proving Werner wrong. You were saving a memory that humanity almost lost forever. I'm sorry I didn't see that sooner. Come home when you're ready. Klaus read it 3 times, tears blurring the screen. He'd sacrificed everything, his savings, his reputation, his marriage, for stones that dead people had deliberately buried. And somehow, impossibly, it had mattered. The documentary aired 6 months later to record viewership. Göbekli Tepe became a household name. Academic textbooks were revised. The narrative of humanity's origins shifted, accommodating the uncomfortable truth that we're not as advanced or unique as we believed. But Klaus's favorite response came from a high school teacher in Ohio. "My students watched your documentary. For the first time in 15 years of teaching, I saw them genuinely interested in ancient history. But more than that, they started asking bigger questions." One student said, "Maybe the ancients weren't primitive. Maybe we're just arrogant. Thank you for giving my students permission to question everything." Klaus pinned that letter above his desk, next to a photograph of Pillar 56. Because that student had understood what most adults missed. Göbekli Tepe wasn't just about archaeology or biblical validation. It was about humility. About recognizing that human wisdom didn't begin with us, and human folly probably won't end with us either. The ancients had built a memorial to survival, then buried it because remembering hurt too much. Klaus had excavated that memory and forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth: we've been here before. We've achieved greatness, lost it, and had to rebuild. The cycle repeats because we keep forgetting the lessons carved in stone. Maybe this time could be different. Maybe by remembering what the ancients tried to forget, humanity could break the pattern. Maybe we could learn to balance progress with humility, advancement with respect for the natural order. Or maybe we'd ignore it all and repeat history, forcing some future archaeologist to excavate our ruins and marvel at how we lost everything despite having all the warnings. Klaus didn't know which future awaited. But he knew his role: keep telling the story. Keep showing the evidence. Keep reminding people that the stones remember even when we choose to forget. As Klaus prepared to return to Germany and rebuild his life, he stood one final time among the pillars. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across stones that had waited 11,000 years to speak. "Thank you," Klaus whispered. "Thank you for not letting us forget completely." He'd done what the survivors couldn't. He'd made sure their warning, their sacrifice, their desperate documentation of a world ending and beginning again, wouldn't be lost to time. The story of Göbekli Tepe, of the preDiluvian people who built monuments to survival and then buried them in collective forgetting, was no longer hidden. And every person who heard it now carried a choice: learn from the warning carved in stone, or become another cautionary tale for future archaeologists. Klaus hoped humanity would choose wisely. The stones would keep speaking to anyone willing to listen. If this journey through forgotten history moved you, subscribe to discover more ancient warnings we've yet to uncover, because the past has more to teach us than we've dared to remember.